And welcome. We're so excited to have you all here with us tonight as we launch our virtual book launch and webinar series tonight, beginning with our first in the series, Bilingual Special Education, Then and Now, Issues and Trends. And as we look at this picture, in our first slide, we see a road, and just think about when we look at this road, we could be looking behind us in the rear view mirror, or we could be looking ahead of us. We like to think that in our text, Bilingual Special Education for the 21st Century, a new interface, we did a 360 view. We took a look at the past, we took a look around at what's going on today, and then we're focused towards what can be for the future. Go on to the next. And so we'd like to welcome you and ask you that as we introduce ourselves, you introduce yourselves as well in the chat with your name, your role, and the city where you are tuning in from. And I am Dr. Tamara Arsace. Everyone calls me Tammy. And I am one of the co-editors of Bilingual Special Education for the 21st Century, and retired from the Buffalo schools after a 30-plus year career as a bilingual educator in bilingual ed, bilingual special ed, and most recently as director of multilingual education for Buffalo schools. And I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Glisa Colon, who will introduce herself.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're so excited to have you all here and working through some of the tech difficulties, but we just invite you all to grab some café con leche, sit back, be comfortable, and enjoy the ride. So again, I'm Dr. Glisa Colon. I am an assistant professor at SUNY Buffalo State, and I have the distinct pleasure of coordinating the Bilingual Special Education Graduate Certificate Program at Buffalo State. So I'm so excited to have had the opportunity to co-edit this text with my amazing academic partner, Dr. Arsace, and we are beyond humbled and thrilled to have the author of our foreword, the person who we have all learned from in the field. I won't call her the godmother of bilingual special ed, but we've all certainly have just learned from her. I know I have over the past 20 years, and I'm just tickled pink to introduce part of our panel, which is Dr. Alba Ortiz.
Good evening, and thank you for those very kind words. I must say, after the number of years I've been in the field, I feel more like the grandmother than the godmother. I'm Alba Ortiz. I retired from the University of Texas at Austin as a member of the special education faculty and director of the multicultural special education program. I was also the director of the Office of Bilingual Education. I began my journey as a speech pathologist in San Antonio, got my doctorate in special education administration, and began working really at the intersection of bilingualism and special education, beginning at San Jose State University, then at Southern Methodist University before joining the UT Austin faculty. My interests are numerous, but probably in a nutshell, the disproportionate representation of emergent bilinguals in special education, how you distinguish language differences from disabilities, and more recently, how you design culturally and linguistically responsive multi-tiered systems of support for these learners. And I'm really happy to join my colleagues tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversations.
Thank you so much, Alba. Alba was a thought partner who was invaluable in the process of developing this book. I also would like to have an introduction from our sponsor, Director of the Auburn West, Michael Duffy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mike Duffy, the new director for the Auburn West. You know, keeping it friendly and keeping it wild if you know us. So we're happy to sponsor this event, to sponsor the Zoom license, to be able to host it. Apologize for any kinks that we're working out with this new webinar format, but we will work out those kinks so that for session 2, there are no issues. But we're happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us in the evening. And it's great to see familiar names in the list and unfamiliar names to me. And really excited to bring these experts to the field to talk about an issue that comes to our office every day, how to best serve these students. So I'm going to turn off my video. I'm not the important person in the room today, but I'm really glad everyone's here. Thank you.
Mike is always an important person. So we want to talk a little bit about our journey. We are colleagues who work together on a number of projects, Glisette and I. And one of those projects is the CUNY Initiative on Immigration and Education, or CUNY-I. And along with that, we work together in the Bilingual Special Ed Teacher Prep Program, which will soon be called the Bilingual Inclusive Teacher Prep Program at Buffalo State College. And together, we had talked about the fact that we both went to the same master's program 20 years apart, because Glisette could be my daughter. And we both used the same text, Bilingual Special Education interface, Baca and Cervantes. It was a seminal work that was first authored in 1984 and reissued several times. I believe it had 5 editions, the last one being in 2004. So for over 20 years, there had not been a comprehensive text that addressed the intersection of bilingual education and special education. And we wanted to do something that would inform educators, practitioners, researchers. And so once we made the decision to forge ahead, there was no turning back. And so we decided, we met with a publisher, IGI Global, and we issued a call for proposals in April of 2021. And we had some fantastic responses. We'll talk a little bit about our chapter authors later, who will be presenting at the future sessions of our webinar series. And we compiled this book, which we think is an amazing work, not because we co-edited it, because of all of the participants that came together to make this a reality. And so here we are in 2022, and the book was published in May, and we're happy to have you here to introduce this work to you and engage you in some great conversation this evening.
Thank you, Tammy. Let me just make sure I'm changing my slides correctly here. And so we wanted to really highlight some of the historical underpinnings that came out of the Baca and Cervantes book that we talk about in our text, because it's really important to understand where we came from to have some clarity on where we need to go, right? So despite the long history of multilingualism, the use of and accommodation for our speakers of other languages, our multilingual learners, has really been a topic of debate, really since the nation's founding, right? And many today still believe that English should be the official language of instruction. And in the Baca and Cervantes text, they demonstrate how pivotal landmark cases, such as Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, right, how they impacted the field of bilingual education. And additionally, they presented 3 broad phases in the evolution of our field, right? We had the awareness phase in the 1970s. This was really the culmination of those landmark cases and several other significant court cases that really ensued in response to the denial of basic rights of our students, our multilingual students and their families. And eventually this led to the development of bilingual special education programs. And I want to highlight the special because that's really what we're talking about here today. And then in the second phase, programs that address both the linguistic and special education needs of our multilingual learners who were dual identified began to crop up around the country, and institutes of higher ed and colleges began to prepare teachers in this area. And these programs were provided, they provided instruction in the home language and in English for our students who also received special education services. And they continued to be developed and refined into the third phase, which was the phase of program refinement and institutionalization. And by the time that the fourth edition of the Baca and Cervantes text was published, they claimed that these types of programs could be found in most major school districts around the country. But what we're seeing now is Tammy and I truly believe that we're now in a new phase that almost takes us back to where we started. We have seen a decrease in available programs, specifically bilingual special education, but even in all types of bilingual education programmings. And so we really need to build awareness of the fact that bilingual special education settings are disappearing in the wake of this massive teacher shortages that we're all facing, certainly also as a result of racist and ethnocentric ideas and policies around language, and a continued siloing of the fields of bilingual education and special education at all levels. And so that really was the impetus and the inspiration behind the need to bring about work that speaks to this issue in a practical manner so that we can plan actions for the next step. And so with that, we want to share some really important data that everybody in the field really needs to be a part of, right? This data is part of our very lengthy preface written by Tammy and myself. I will be sharing the link at some point today. The preface is available online for everybody to read, where we really go into detail about the data, demographics, and statistics about bilingual special education then, right, in the early 2000s, and where we are now. And here are some data points that Tammy and I really want to highlight, right? We know that there's been an evolution. And by the way, we encourage you all to interact in the chat, post your questions to the Q&A, and we will get to them. But we want to highlight the fact that the way we refer to our multilingual learners has evolved throughout the years. Gone are the days where we refer to our students as limited, as that is a very deficit-oriented perspective. We are really wanting and to showcase the importance of validating who they are and allowing them to simply be. And so the terms multilingual and emergent bilingual are really the accepted terminology of today. And I invite you to read that section in our preface. We actually devote a section to, called What's in a Name in our preface, because historically our students have been referenced in a very deficit-oriented way, not being valued for the assets they bring into the classroom. And so it's really important that we keep in mind how we are referring to our students. This applies to our students who are multilingual, to our students who have disabilities, and certainly to our students who have both, right? And then when we look at the demographics, the statistics of our students, we can see here that there's been an increase. 10.2% of the public school population are classified as having English language learners. That is an increase from 9.1. So, and this shouldn't be a surprise to us, right? We know that for many reasons, the multilingual demographic has increased in our public schools. Yet when we look at, and also our students with disability, our special education population has also increased from about 14.2% to now 14.6% of the total student population. But what I think is really important to highlight that many people are not aware of is that when we look at the special education population, 26% of the special education population are Hispanic or Latino students. And I think that's a comment that should make us all go, what, right? That just cannot be. It cannot be that because one is Hispanic or Latino, that you're inherently deficient in some way. Yet the data is showing that that is what's happening in our public schools. Now, that's not to say that all Hispanic or Latino students are also English language learners. We don't want to perpetuate that myth. But the largest language background of our English language learners are Hispanic and Latino. So we have to pay special attention to what is happening within that demographic of students. At the time of the Baca and Cervantes publication and in the early 2000s, Hispanic students were not necessarily more likely to be identified with a particular disability, but today that is the case. Hispanics are more likely to be identified under IDEA Part B than any other racial and ethnic group, specifically within the speech and language impairment category and the specific learning disability category. And that makes sense, right, with the previous demographic statistic that I just shared about Hispanics being a large percentage of our students with disabilities. And so what does that mean? That as a field, we continue to struggle with being able to parse out the nuances when determining if whatever the child is struggling with is due to a language difference or a language disability. And not only are we still struggling with it, but the data shows that we've actually regressed and are doing poorer than we have previously. When we really dissect the data even more, Tammy is a guru at looking at data, and I just love how she's able to parse out some things here. When we specifically look at students who are dually diagnosed, previously that data was not required to be reported, but now we have that data. And what we're seeing now is that 15.3% of English language learners have disabilities. So that is a disproportionately higher amount because 14.6% of this total student population have disabilities. But when we look at the ELL population, it jumps up to 15.3, right? So English language learners are more likely to be classified as having a disability. When we look at the overall population of the public schools, about 10.2 of them are English language learners, right? But when we look at the overall student with disability population, 11.28 are English language learners. So in every way that we look at the data, there's just a number that confirms that there's a disproportionate representation of language learners, more specifically our Spanish-speaking language learners in special education. And now we see that most states provide very limited, if any, discussion about English language learners with disabilities. And whereas we previously said that the bilingual special education programs could be seen all across the country, they have been removed or taken away for many reasons, right, that we can unpack today. But we're seeing less and less of programs and services that really support our students who are dually diagnosed. And let's position our conversation today from two sides of the coin. The data that I just presented confirms that disproportionality is still a problem. So we have work to do to make sure that we are identifying our students correctly. But we also need to acknowledge the fact that there are English language learners that do indeed have a disability. And how are we providing quality and equitable services to those students? So we really need to keep both ideas in mind when we're having this conversation.
Thank you, Lisette. And if I can say one thing that we talked about the language being important, and the reason that you see ELL so much throughout that previous slide is that that is how it is referred to in the data from the federal government. So we refer to them the same way that they were referred to in the data. And so now we just want to delve into some of the issues that we have noticed are most apparent in the literature and with districts across the country, and here in Buffalo and in New York State as well, and are addressed by a lot of the chapters in the book. Identification, eligibility, and placement are continuing issues. And these issues, by the way, are not new. They're issues that have continued to we've attempted to address them throughout the years, but they keep cropping up again. So of course, over and underrepresentation is just mentioned, and a lot of that, I saw a question pop up about whether that was because of the lack of bilingual personnel to assess the students, and yes, that's absolutely a problem. Not only the personnel, but the instruments to accurately assess and progress monitor. MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support that are not sensitive to the compound effects of bilingualism and the assets that our students bring in their home language. Access to quality bilingual programs. There's a belief that if a student becomes a student with disability, they no longer need bilingual ed, or that they shouldn't qualify for dual language programs and other types of specialty programs. The students' linguistic needs do not end when they become identified as a student with a disability. And then parent perceptions are another issue. Parent perceptions of disability and the cultural implications of an identification or a perception of a disability. And then under curriculum and instruction, there's a need to identify culturally and linguistically responsive and sustaining practices across settings and across instructional practices like specially designed instruction, and in the development of IEPs and the accommodations and modifications, the provision of English language development classes and home language instruction, assessment and transition planning, and then socio-emotional learning. And then of course, when we go up to look at from a bird's eye view at the systemic and structural issues, the siloed nature of our systems, bilingual, ESL, SPED, Gen Ed, they're all separate systems, usually in local school districts and state education agencies, and at the federal level, we see that these systems are separated, and we need more collaboration and alignment between them. And then the separate funding streams perpetuate that. So we need to look at what are the needs of the students, and then provide the funding that supports them just in spite of their labels. And then of course, teacher prep also is under that siloed nature. And so we need teacher prep programs that address the intersections of all of those identities of our students.
I agree. And if I can steal one of your sayings, Tammy, Tammy loves her sandwich metaphor, right? How can we create collaboration across the different departments at all levels, right? And so I want to challenge you all in your different positions to reach out, across the hall, if you will, to do some collaboration, because if we wait for it to start from the top down, it's going to take some time, right? But if we also work on it from bottom up, as the top is coming down, it's going to spread like that sandwich, right? And so we want to invite you to think about that metaphor and see, what can I do on Monday to try to break down some of the silos between the bilingual teachers, the gen ed teachers, the special education teachers. Oh, okay. And so these are just some key components of the book. So those issues that Tammy just talked about, we have the dedicated chapters that really go into depth about not just what the problem is, because I think as a field, as academics, we do a great job of having dialogue, right? But the authors are challenging us in giving us some practical recommendations and solutions. And what's nice is that each chapter has a make and take, right, that you can try in your classroom. And so today, a lot of what we're talking about today is in our preface, the then and the now. Again, I will be sharing that link with you all, and I invite you to bookmark it and read it. The first chapter starts with a beautiful discussion about who are the gatekeepers that are controlling access for our students with disabilities to be educated in bilingual education settings. And so it's a beautiful chapter, Mind the Gatekeepers, that really goes into depth about access to dual language education for our multilingual learners with disabilities. Chapter 2 dives into what are the cultural and linguistically responsive teaching practices that we can embed into a bilingual setting that is inclusive to those who have disabilities. And then we move on to issues of identification eligibility. We have a chapter that focuses on culturally attuned assessment and practices, right? That pre-referral stage and the practices that you can use in your everyday classroom. We then move on to a robust discussion of multi-tiered systems of support, but more specifically, how do we make our multi-tiered systems of support in our schools automatically culturally and linguistically responsive? A big issue in the field is that our schools have MTSS, and then the cultural and linguistic piece is an add-on, and they're asking, how can we also do that, when it should just be part of the initial conversations? And then, as I mentioned earlier, we want students, there are students that do indeed have disabilities and have IEPs. So we really highlight the fact that we need to pay attention to both their language needs and their disability needs. We move on to specially designed instruction, the writing development of our English language learners. We have an amazing chapter on social emotional learning, specifically the use of mindfulness with our language learners, and a chapter about transition planning for those older kiddos with disabilities. And just some special features to highlight in the text. We have an international perspective, how to prepare teachers in other countries, specifically Spanish-speaking countries, and help those students with disabilities learn English as a foreign language. Some really great implications to help us with our bilingual special education. And then we have a beautiful chapter that talks about cultural perceptions of disabilities, specifically from the perspective of the Dominican Republic. We have an amazing foreword written by Dr. Alba Ortiz. I recommend that you read that. That's also available online. I'll be sharing the link. We have a beautiful afterword from Juliana Uturbey, which is the 2021 National Teacher of the Year. And then we have some amazing editorial advisory, our advisory board, some of which are in the virtual room now. Kathy Escamilla, specifically, I'd like to highlight Kathy Escamilla, Tatiana Klein, Kate Menken, and Pedro Noguera for being critical thought partners on this work with us. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is just the authors in our book, but you'll be able to see all that in the links that I'll be sharing.
Yes, and some of our chapter authors are also here today.
Yes.
And will be joining us in the future sessions to delve in deeper to all of those topics that Glisette just quickly showed you. We also are not going to spend a lot of time today on the implications of all of this, but as we continue the discussion and in our final session, we will spend a lot of time talking about the implications for future research and practice. But some of the common themes that did come out were the need for culturally and linguistically responsive practices across settings and all aspects of the educational process. In other words, whenever we're making decisions about materials, about programming, about placement, about all of the different aspects of the educational process, we have to put them through a culturally and linguistically responsive and sustaining lens. And think about, are these decisions disproportionately impacting our students negatively, or are they benefiting from policies and practices that lift them up and provide them with what their specific needs are? Another theme was access to high quality, inclusive bilingual and biliteracy program options. If we truly believe that bilingual education is valuable and benefits our students and that bilingualism is an asset, why wouldn't we want to offer that to our bilingual students with disabilities? The need for collaboration across all levels and stakeholder groups. And that means from the federal government to the state to the local governments, but also within districts, across departments, and across stakeholder groups. As well as a need to better understand families of bilingual and multilingual learners with disabilities and include them in the decision-making along with students when it's appropriate. and the need for more research and best practices on subgroups of students, their literacy development, delving in more to students identified as long-term English learners or multilingual learners, students with disabilities that are moderate and severe. There are, we couldn't include everything in this iteration of the book, but some of these are our ideas for future research and scholarship and practice. Most of all, we have a need for advocacy and action. And we, in our final chapter, talk about the CUNY Initiative on Immigration and Education and how it's focused around advocacy and action. We don't want to continue to admire the problem, or 20 years from now, we'll be here still talking about these same issues. We want to move forward in our meeting the needs of our students. And with all of that, it takes us to our discussion. We want to bring in Dr. Ortiz, and we're again so thrilled to have her here today. We have some questions we want to ask her, and then we're opening it up to others to ask through the Q&A in the chat. So Dr. Ortiz, again, thank you for being here today. We're going to stop the PowerPoint so we can actually see her and not her picture. And hello, and we want to ask you, what are some of the greatest challenges you've encountered or that you know exist in the field?
Thank you for that question. And I'm actually going to give a very brief answer because I think the two of you did a great job of introducing those issues. I think for me, disproportionate representation is the number one issue because it is the net result of a host of underlying problems that characterize the system. I think we start with having to acknowledge that multilingual learners are a very complex student population and that we have not prepared educators to really understand that diversity in a way that allows them to plan educational programs and services appropriately. So oftentimes we are referring students and placing them in special education because the general education system has failed to appropriately address their needs. In the process, I think we have a tendency to focus on the language proficiency and forget to factor in other factors like economic status, race, ethnicity, prior schooling, access to appropriate instruction, so that all of those can be factors that explain the learning problems that we are looking at from the lens of a special education or disability issue. We continue to have a limited availability of appropriate instruments and procedures to really identify the disability. And I actually have very little hope that we ever will have those. So I think disproportionate representation really is the symbol of a lot of issues within the system. I think the higher education system has failed to keep up with the changing demography, and that we have not addressed the fact that teachers, general ed, special education, school psychologists, speech pathologists, et cetera, are going to serve culturally and linguistically diverse children. So they need to be prepared to do that. We have a shortage of bilingual educators, English as a new language educators. We have very few general education teachers that have depth of knowledge about multilingual learners. And yet, in most states, the majority of multilingual learners are served in English as a new language or English as a second language programs. They spend the majority of their day in general education classrooms, and it's typically that teacher that generates a referral. And so when we have teachers that are not prepared to serve the learner, we're going to be in a cycle that generates students that need intervention because they're underperforming. In an MTSS system, which I think has tremendous potential to help English learners, we don't have highly trained interventionists, reading specialists, math specialists that can deal with linguistic and cultural diversity. So in many school systems, multilingual learners qualify for those services, but they don't get them because of the lack of appropriately trained personnel. So oftentimes it's the classroom teacher that needs to provide intervention, and they may not have the skills to do that, to provide those services. Once a student is referred, the chances are 70 to 90% that they're going to wind up in special education, largely because they're unlikely to be assessed by a bilingual school psychologist or a bilingual speech pathologist or behavioral specialist. And even though we use multi-tiered systems of support, we haven't figured out how to link that system with the special education assessment and eligibility determination process. So that's a huge issue in the field. And then finally, special education becomes a dead end. It becomes a life sentence for so many of our students, because special educators they know how to serve disability, but they don't know how to serve the intersection of language, culture, and disabilities. So we send them to special education because we think they will receive a better education, and that's not always the case. There isn't any easy fix. And I think one of the issues that receives very little attention is that we don't have the higher education personnel like yourselves who can provide the training. So we can't change the field if we don't have the expertise among the faculty who are preparing the students. I don't think we have enough expertise at the state and district level in terms of leadership personnel, and that's where the decisions are made about programs and services. And I certainly think that federal, state, and local policy has a lot of gaps that need to be addressed. So there are a host of issues, very difficult problems to resolve.
Absolutely. And Dr.
Mhm.
Raquel Schmidt in the chat, also one of our chapter authors, mentions that also failure of seeing values of multilingual learners as their value add to society. Europe and South America has done a much better job of that than US they used to, also redefining concept of disability. We're using 20th century definitions for 21st century challenges. Yeah, I'm going to give a snap to that for Dr. Schmidt. She's absolutely
No, I would like to piggyback on that. I watch a lot of sports, and when people from other countries win, they're interviewed and they speak perfect English. And so in this country we say, see, the rest of the world speaks English, so why do we need to learn another language, which is certainly short-sighted. So yeah, we're certainly behind. Someone asked the question in the chat about parents who think that their children might be better off in an English language program with parents supporting home language development. And I think one thing that we need to think about, which is related to this point, is that increasingly we're beginning to see the benefits of dual language programs, so much so that in some states they prize dual language programs, but for monolingual English speakers. So our kids are getting crowded out in some states, but that is a sign that bilingualism is seen as an asset, an advantage, educationally, economically. So we need to make sure that that parent understands that they're actually impeding their child's development by choosing the option to provide an English-only instruction, because the rest of the world that's beginning to understand is trying to get kids into dual language programs.
Yeah, that brings us to really an interesting topic. I invite the participants to look into racial linguistics, right? Because bilingualism or multilingualism is valued, but really the question is whose bilingualism and multilingualism is valued. And we are seeing a huge issue where, to be honest, let's have an honest conversation, bilingual education is being gentrified. And those seats are not being available or be made to access by our bilingual students. And so it really, we have to, when we're having this conversation, we cannot discount the impact that racism and linguicism has on that value for our own communities.
Mhm. Absolutely. So, Dr. Ortiz, what are some of your recommendations for future scholarship and practice?
Well, there are a host of those. I think we need a lot of research to refine what we know. I think one of the differences between 1984 and today is that we have the same issues, but we know a lot more, but there's not enough research. So we need to continue to examine what contributes to disproportionate representation. We need to continue to really figure out how do you distinguish a second language difference from a disability, or how cultural differences influence student performance, and how you sort out those differences. I think it's important to focus attention on topics that have really received very little attention. Multilingual learners with gifts and talents, those that have severe cognitive or sensory disabilities, what we would consider positive behavioral supports for students that have emotional disturbance or socio-emotional learning issues. How do we really make multi-tiered systems of support? And in the preschool early intervention arena, recognition and response frameworks, culturally and linguistically responsive, because I think we've paid very little attention to multilingual learners birth through age 5 in the special education field. And so that's a largely unexplored field. What are effective instructional arrangements for multilingual learners with disabilities, given that continuum of special education instructional arrangements that we have in schools? And then we need a lot more research on students with disabilities that speak languages other than Spanish, because those really create some huge challenges for service providers. I think in whatever research we do, we need to foreground language so that we understand the impact of bilingual language development. We need an assessment system that really does give students credit for what they know in their home language, in English, when they use translanguaging practices, because I think for the most part, disproportionate representation happens because we assess in English. Very few students assessed in their home language. And then we really need to work on screening and progress monitoring components of the MTSS system. I am really astounded that in MTSS, we assess reading, writing, math, but we don't screen and progress monitor oral language. And yet that's a defining characteristic of multilingual populations. I think we need to do a better job of disseminating what we know. So I think that's one of the contributions of your book, because as I said, we know a lot more, but our problem is that what we know is not being implemented. And so we need to make sure, particularly since we're in an era of evidence-based practices, that the evidence base for multilingual learners and multilingual learners with disabilities is recognized, respected, and implemented, so that these students have a greater chance of meeting their potential. Tendency to use instructional practices that have worked with monolingual English speakers and just assume that they're going to work with English, with multilingual learners, including those with disabilities. I think we need to pay attention to federal law and policy, because federal and state law and policy give us guidance, but they don't really give us any recommendations. And the federal officials will always say, we don't recommend any program or any service, any line of attack. And yet, because they are insisting on evidence-based practice, I think they need to be held accountable for why so many states implement English-only instructional programs in spite of the research that says emergent bilinguals, including those with disabilities, do better when they are provided access to their home language. So that's a lot of work that I think researchers and practitioners need to do.
That's actually a really great segue into one of the questions here in the Q&A, where Rose asks, how do we address bilingual students that have social language but not academic language in Spanish and are classified with a disability? So perhaps you can shed some light on some assessment practices that can be used.
Well, I think that it kind of harkens back to what I was saying earlier, that we don't tend to assess oral language in general. And we don't tend to assess using instruments and procedures that tap into those higher level language skills. And there are all kinds of informal assessment strategies that you can use to get at that academic language, home language or English. You can do dictations, you can do closed passages, you can do storytelling, story retelling that require students to use language to create messages that are cohesive, that are carefully sequenced, that are elaborated, that really in the genre of instruction incorporate in accountable talk. So they're elaborated responses that provide a rationale or evidence for the position that you're taking. And so that academic language has to be taught and fostered by teachers, but teachers then need to monitor whether students are learning it. I can't think of a literacy lesson, for example, that would not have an academic language development component that wouldn't be followed by an assessment to see if students are developing that higher order vocabulary, higher order grammatical, syntactical structures, narrative structures, etc.
If I could add on to that, thank you. And that's true that often we're assessing for those things, but not actually having taught it. Academic language has to be taught explicitly and not only in vocabulary, but in complex and compelling text. And we don't expose our students to that enough. Dr. Lily Wong-Fillmore will say that we create long-term English learners and students with disabilities by not exposing them, by dumbing down the text.
Right, and I can't recall the name of the author, but I read an article not too long ago that said that we really speak to the importance of oral language development and the importance of developing students, listening comprehension, vocabulary, grammar, fluency, et cetera. But that when you go in and observe in classrooms, teachers spend 6% or less time on the oral language component in the instructional delivery. And so when we see kids that are referred to special education, they typically are referred for reading issues. The reading issue is typically comprehension. When you look at the interventions that have been provided, they're typically reading interventions. But when you examine the content of those interventions, there's very little focus on the oral language development. So kids don't have the discipline-specific, content-specific language that they need to do those comprehension tasks. We don't do enough of that in the home language, and we don't do enough of that in English.
True. So let's see, we have
There's an additional question in the Q&A. I've answered part of it just because Tammy and I so happen to be addressing this issue today in a previous meeting. But when we talk about the issue of lack of qualified personnel, Rose asked the question, do you think that districts offering no incentives for bilingual professionals is a part of the problem in recruiting? And I certainly gave my answer to that we do believe that that's part of the challenge, but it is a big piece of it, and the unions are a part of that. And so advocacy is needed in that area, specifically us as a collective reaching out to our elected officials to make them aware of the issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there also should be incentives for all personnel to develop this expertise. It speaks to what you were talking about as silos, because if in programs that are English as a second language or English as a new language programs, in those programs, if students are being pulled out for 60 to 90 minutes a day, and they're spending the rest of the day in the mainstream classroom, there should be an incentive or a requirement, at least, for those teachers to be able to accommodate and scaffold language development, because otherwise students are not going to be able to achieve the standards. I think professional development for teachers is key. And I think that it needs to be incorporated into every topic that's presented so that teachers don't have to go to 100 different sessions to figure out how you address the needs of a multilingual learner and a multilingual learner. with disabilities, because oftentimes when professional development is siloed, the people that need it the most don't go to the sessions they need.
Mhm.
Absolutely. We have a comment in the
We-
Q&A. Oh, go ahead, Tammy.
Oh, we posted a question as well in the
Yes.
Q&A. Thank you, Tatiana Klein, one of our advisory committee and friend, for posting for us the question: what are some of your district's positive practices and greatest challenges in serving your multilingual learners with disabilities? Do they
Yeah.
align with some of the things that we've presented, or are there things that are nagging at you that we've missed?
So we invite you all to click on type answer and interact with that question that Tatiana posted. I also want to acknowledge a point that one of the attendees made to us. Thank you for stating these important points. We're all trying to move the profession forward. The 70s and 80s were a crucial time for the profession. How do we recapture that energy in order to help current parents see the need to fight for the rights of their children, and the need for all of us to see the need for a free and appropriate public education? I think that's an excellent question.
I think we have to keep working at getting the parents fired up, because they don't realize their own power. They don't realize sometimes that there's what their children's rights are.
Yeah.
We have to continue to provide as much education as we can, and get the parents fired up.
Yeah. It's always surprising to me, and I know that we have educators in the room that are not from New York State, but I'll use New York State as an example. It's always surprising to me when I ask students, bilingual students and their families, anything about Part 154, and they know nothing about the regulation, and certainly they don't know about their rights and responsibilities in that regulation. And so I tend to like to stir it up a little bit by providing PD to students and families about Part 154, but I think that needs to be replicated across the country. When parents come into the room, into the Board of Ed rooms, to the state meetings, a lot more seems to get done than when us educators ask for things. So I think leveraging, I don't want to say build the capacity of our families, because they have the capacity, but we need to leverage the capacity of our communities.
One of the most disappointing conversations I have with parents of multilingual learners with disabilities is a parent that tells me that, their child has developed their bilingualism and seems to do very well, but they've been identified with a disability, and the school personnel have convinced them that they should be dismissed from the bilingual education
Yes.
program. And so to me, that's an instance where the parent is the one who knows, and the educator is the one who is creating the obstacle and really denying a fundamental right, to the child and the parent.
Sure, because their home language development is being stifled at a certain age, while at the same time other students might maybe benefiting from dual language development throughout their educational process, right? We have a question that says, as a former special education teacher, curriculum from the district ignores the needs of special education students. It's become about meeting a number and not about the student. IEP goals are ignored. How do special ed teachers combat this? That's a great question.
That is a great question, because it basically resides in the person. What I have found is that so many districts have moved to using computerized IEPs, and they crank out these very long IEPs, but they don't provide the support the teachers need, or in this instance, the curriculum or the recommendations for adapting the curriculum, accommodating the students' needs. And so I think that's an area where collaboration is key. So working together with other personnel to try to make it a less complex issue. And then really working with school leaders, because to me, they're the ones that are responsible for providing the resources and making sure that students' needs are met. So if we can work on the leaders and then work on parents to put pressure on the system, we may be able to do something about it.
Thank you so much. Our time has flown by. We're 3 minutes away from the hour, and we don't want to hold anybody up. So we are going to
I'll
say
bring up
that
my screen, yes.
you can continue sending us your questions and comments and input as you continue to participate. We want to make sure that you know that parts of the book, the preface, the foreword, the afterword are available free at IGI Global. If you are interested in purchasing a book, there is a 50% discount if you use the code IGI50 at the IGI website. If you buy it and from some other site, that code won't work. You'd have to buy it right from the publisher. A 50% discount is significant because the book is expensive. And we also want to remind you that we have a series, the chapter authors who are here tonight will be featured in our future sessions. It's divided by the sections of the book. You want to go to the next slide where
Yes,
we have
The
the date?
QR code, if you want to take a moment to scan the QR code that's behind our beautiful faces and on the screen will take you to the registration link for the next sessions. This is where the authors are going to be able to dive deep into the issues and challenges and potential solutions that we present in the book. So our next webinar series talks about the foundations, which is looking at access to dual language education, as well as culturally and linguistically responsive practices for our students with disabilities. In February, we'll dive deep into identification and eligibility. In April, curriculum and instruction. And then in June, we'll wrap it up with promising practices around the world and next steps as proposed by Tammy and I.
We want to thank the Arborn West for their sponsorship and support, and Mike Duffy in particular, and the whole team at the Arborn for helping us with launching this virtual webinar series. And we want to especially thank our wonderful special guest today, Dr. Alba Ortiz. Thank you so much for all that you've done to help us and to be here today. It's wonderful to see you and to hear from you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm placing our emails in the chat, my email and Tammy's email. If there was a burning comment, question that we didn't get to today, please feel free to email us. We can forward any questions directly to Dr. Ortiz if there's something that you want to ask her specifically. But estamos aquí a las órdenes. Remember that it takes a village. Estamos en familia. We have to do this work together. So thank you,
Dr.
everyone.
Ortiz, do you have any parting words that you'd like to say?
No, thank you very much. I encourage all of you to read the book.
Thanks so much. And
Thank you
thank
so
you all
much.
the participants for being here today.
Have a great night, everyone.